Thank you, Ken.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ken. Guess what? Gerry used to have hair as long as Ken.
A while back.
What happened?
My teacher.
Well, it's my happy role to tell you a little bit about the personal background of George. Some of you know this story well. I'm sorry to bore you, but I will talk a little bit about Dad's background. And can we have a slide, something up there? Oh, okay. That's a very nice photo by Paul Macapia of Dad with his maquettes. So George was a proud American. He was born in Seattle and grew up in Japan, but came back to Seattle at the age of 17. So anyway, he was a Kibe, which means that he and also my mother were born in the U.S., grew up in Japan, and came back. So they were completely bicultural and bilingual. So it really lent a lot of richness to our lives so that we had the elements of both Japanese culture and aesthetic forms and also Western forms. He went to the University of Washington and got both his degrees in art and began teaching in 1947. He served in the U.S. Army during the war, and in fact, my mother was locked up and imprisoned at Tule Lake camp in Northern California, where he met her because he went to visit his cousins, his sister and others from his family, the Moriguchi family, who came to own Uwajimaya. But he met my mother there, and both being Kibe and both being from the same prefecture of Okayama made for a really good marriage. So after the war, she came up to Seattle, and then Dad began his career working more and more in teaching at the University of Washington and eventually getting into the public art realm.
Okay, my name is Gerard Tsutakawa. I usually go by Gerry. Thank you all for coming out today, and thank you for the museum for having us here for this talk and slideshow and walk through the gallery. I was raised in a house full of art. And in 1971, I actually started working for my father. Well, actually, all of us kids worked in the shop a little bit. Pushing the broom or cleaning up. Excuse me, but I kind of had an affinity for working with my hands. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. So in 1971, I did my first fabrication for my father. It was the fountain in Bellevue on Northeast 8th Street and in front of the Chase. Currently, it's a Chase Bank. And from 1971 to about 1990, I fabricated, welded, assembled, installed, and read blueprint drawings from his engineer, Jack Uchida, and was a kind of an apprentice assistant. And then later on, I started doing my own sculptures and public art, but basically grew up in the shop and around all of his sculptural pieces.
That's a really great segue to one of my first questions here, and I'm just wondering, were you allowed into the studio when you were younger, before you actually started apprenticing? Were you allowed into the studio, and what was that like?
Well, yeah. The studio was kind of open, and there was a lot of art events at the house. I would come down to the basement, and my father would be working on a wood carving piece. He did several wood carvings back in the 50s and early 60s. So I got to pick up a chisel and chip away or sand or grind on a little piece of wood by myself. I remember making hydroplanes that we towed behind the bicycle around the driveway, and all kinds of little things like that, woodworking projects. Yeah.
Mayumi, do you have some memories?
Well, I have to say that it was a very open atmosphere and synthesis. My mother was quite involved in the Japanese arts, music and dance, Japanese traditional dance. And so it was all infused throughout the house. And they had a lot of friends who were Japanese artists visiting, famous Japanese artists from Japan visiting. So there would be these parties. And my mom was a great hostess because she had grown up in a restaurant family, and she was an excellent chef. So there would be these family parties with the artists, and in fact, some of the painters would, whether it's Mark Toby or Paul Horiuchi, would be sitting there right at the table in the living room at a low table and trying out their skills with the sumi brush. So it was very open for us as kids to just walk through, and my dad made a point of introducing me to like George Nakashima and Isamu Noguchi when they came to visit.
Right. This next slide is a self-portrait of your father. Could you tell me what are some of the aspects of him that you see in this portrait?
Do you know what year that is on the?
I don't know what year this is.
On the
I'm sorry.
Slide?
1948.
Yeah. Well, my father was interested in Western art quite a bit in the 30s and 40s, studying European art and, different abstract expressionisms and all that. So a lot of his paintings in that era were influenced by, Western themes, surrealism and all that. If you look at some of the early oil paintings, they all have this very kind of impressionistic flavor to them. So this was a self-portrait and early one.
Do you think it captures some of how you knew him?
Well, there's a lot of. I think he was experimenting, and he did a lot of different forms of art. In high school, he had an art teacher, and they did woodblock paint prints and illustrations, and he started early and just kind of went through watercolor, oil paintings, not sumi drawings, but tempera and pencil drawings. So I think this is just kind of an extension of that theme. You see that sphere in the bottom, that's a kind of a surrealistic feel to it.
Well, I would like to say that this is much too serious for Dad. This expression, he was just a very upbeat and positive person. He and my mom would tell jokes, bilingual jokes with Japanese and English mixed together, and they loved to enjoy life. So this is pretty serious, and I think that it follows on his graduate work at the University of Washington, where they're pretty much required to do every type of artwork. So this would be an example of one of his graduate school kind of themes.
This work called Evil Eye was kind of a sculpture. It was a fixture at your house for quite a while, right? Yeah.
I'll talk about it. Evil Eye. This is a bronze sculpture. And in the early days of highway construction, they were going to expand the I-90 freeway to about 12 lanes. And the original idea was to cut a trench that would go right up to our front door and then build a 12-lane freeway underneath and then fill it. Of course, my father was very upset about this, so he created a sculpture, and it was called Evil Eye on I-90, which is... You can probably barely see it through the trees, but this was looking toward the I-90 highway. And of course, they went through, a lot of redesigns, and eventually they cut a tunnel through and reduced it down to, I think, 8 lanes. But this sculpture was spun. The half spheres were spun at a metal shop on Jackson Street called Van's Metal Spinning. And George was kind of interested in the technique, so he did a couple of sculptures. And of course, this one's upstairs. I'm sure you've all seen it. Yeah. So, since it served as kind of a talisman at your house, have you noticed anything, any changes in the air or the vibe around the house with it being gone?
Well, the main thing that you notice is that those trees have grown up a lot. You can't see I-90 bridge anymore. So no, I don't know. We have a interesting neighborhood. The house is well, we used to say 1910. Maybe it's actually 1905. 1905, but it's a large Mount Baker style craftsman home, and in fact, my mother helped to make it possible for the family to acquire a couple of houses around the area, so that we have a very positive kind of family street, and people have told us we should just, rename it Tsutakawa Alley or something, because we're on both sides of the street and there are a couple of houses there.
So many of George's furniture works are functional elements in your current home, yeah?
Yeah, a lot of these pieces, are in use around the house. But this is from just after my parents were married, and they didn't have a lot of money, and so George was making furniture, and he made platforms, he made tables, he made chairs. So this was a piece that he designed, and I think there was a lot of interesting designs like this going on in that era. But this was basically 3 pieces of plywood, and they interlocked, so you could take it apart and fold it flat. But assemble it and hold it, and it was self-supporting. So there was a couple of chairs that go with this that were pretty amazing how they were created and designed.
I imagine in the house, just growing up, every table, every chair, every dresser just being exquisite and beautiful. Was this the case, and did you have to take special care as kids around these objects?
Well, my mother discovered Deltite, so she started to buy some really nice furniture from there. So no, not every piece, but my dad was a great recycler, and when I moved out and lived in different places during college and after, he would come up with using some recycled plywood or something, and he would stain it, and he would give me a bookcase or a shelf or something that he made, because he wanted to keep his hands busy and use recycled wood. But no, not everything was like that.
Yeah, but my father was a real craftsman, and you look at some of the lamps that are upstairs, and they're very well and intricately created, and like our coffee table that we still use today, and side chairs and things like that are all his works.
Yeah, they both had very good taste, and they invested in things that were of excellent design and really strong pieces.
Oops, going too fast, sorry. So this piece is called Eternal Laughter, and it is one of my favorite pieces that's on display in our exhibition. Can you talk to us a little bit about George's sense of humor, like what made him laugh and what made him most joyful?
The most joyful? Mm-hmm. Well, he did like sake. And I mean, it's part of Japanese life, right? Japanese American life. You have to have a toast with every event. Our family was not religious in any way, and he was very, very involved in studying the ancient civilizations of the world: Egyptian, Etruscan, Aztec. He had so many inspirations from early cultures of the world. And I think that he saw the human expressions of people and cultures in different concrete forms, like sculpture. So he did name pieces after expressions of sentimentality, or of the pure emotions like happiness. So this would be an example of the eternal laughter being one of the really true important aspects of human life.
Yeah, he also did a series of these. So this is not just one, but there was several editions of this. And basically, he was going through a period of doing, non-commissioned studio work, kind of in the scale. and most of them are bronze. And there was a piece called Sentinel, and so he wasn't, he was doing these for clients, but they were not commissioned work. And I think this one was one of the most successful.
Would you mind sharing one of the most joyful memories you have with your dad?
Pardon?
Joyful memory.
Well, I don't know. They're all great sculptures and all that. So I don't know. There were so many art pieces. I don't know if there was something for each individual artwork. Mm-hmm. But they were strong pieces, so you appreciate, their design. Yeah. Hundreds of pieces, though.
But I hope that we're going to get to some paintings. And I have to say, as kids, joyful memories would include going on trips, either camping or driving up to the Cascades or the Olympic Peninsula, and eventually our place at Hood Canal. Dad loved water, salt water. He grew up in Okayama, which is next to the inland sea, the Seto Naikai in Japan. And he liked fishing, and so these became really good memories for all of us, swimming and fishing and matsutake tori, looking for the mushrooms in the mountains. So these also served as inspiration for some of his paintings that of nature.
So he also talks about when he was a youngster, the company that his father owned had a place on Bainbridge.
Yeah.
And his job was to go out and capture the dinner, seafood. And he talks about walking around the shores of Bainbridge, picking octopus out of the rocks with a stick or catching crabs and things like that. So there are a lot of early memories that he'd talk about that he enjoyed.
Well, it's a nice segue to our next slide here. This is called Three Codfish. And personally, I really love George's work, his Sumi series, the cookbook that this appeared in. You mentioned some of the parties and that your house was known for its food and such. Can you tell us a quick story about one in particular that stands out in your memory?
Well, my father loved to go fishing. So he would, and it wasn't fancy. Well, we'd go to Westport and salmon fish and things like that. But most of the time, it was just a drop line. And we'd do that at Hood Canal. So he had an affinity for catching fish and doing fish. And then he got asked to do a cookbook illustrations for Judy Guy's, wife of a sculptor friend, John Guy's. So at the time he was doing the Sumi painting, so he got into it, and would bring, fish or crabs or shrimp or vegetables home and put them on the table. If it was crabs, they'd be wiggling around, and he'd do quick Sumi paintings. And so this also just shows what kind of a deft hand he had with the brush. I can't even sign my name like that with a brush, it takes a little bit of practice and skill, but he was very, very, very quick and enjoyed doing all these different food images.
Mm-hmm. So there would be parties with seafood. One of the great fishermen was Yuji Abe.
Yeah. Yep.
He is one of the most famous Japanese print gallerists in Tokyo, and he also was an expert at matting the Sumi paintings to the scroll or the screen. But he was a great fisherman, and when he came to Seattle, the two of them would go out fishing with a couple of beers and come back with fantastic food and cook it all, cut it up and cook it. First there would be sashimi, and then eventually they would get to the tempura course, and there are a lot of positive things about seafood.
I'm going to skip ahead 2 slides to just kind of piggyback on what Gerry was saying. And this work, Stretching, is one of George's many Sumi paintings. Mm-hmm. And you said that you can't even do a brush stroke like his name. Do you have any memories about
actually, my father started doing Sumi in the I guess it's probably the early 60s. Well, he was influenced by Mark Tobey, who told George, you should look at your roots and go back to that. And my father started picking up the brush again. Of course, he'd been raised with a brush when he was a young man a student in Japan. So he started doing brush paintings, and eventually led to the painting of seafood and all that. But Mayumi mentions Yuji Abe. Yuji Abe had a gallery in Tokyo called Yosedo Gallery, and his specialty was restoring Japanese scrolls. And he was at the Cleveland Art Museum, and he was at the Seattle Art Museum restoring their collection. And he was just a meticulous craftsman. And he taught my father this technique called urauchi, which is taking your rice paper, which is mulberry, and wetting it after it's painted. The sumi doesn't run, and he would wet the painting and put it on a board, and the board had a border with another mulberry paper on it that was stretched, and my father would make the glue, which was a rice glue, and lay the painting on the stretched board, and the glue would adhere to the backing. And that's why these paintings are so flat. You write on paper with water, and it wrinkles it up. Watercolor paper is extra heavy. But that was a technique that he used in quite a few of his sumi paintings, that people don't realize that George was doing his own urauchi.
There's a photograph in the exhibition of George in the studio, and there's many sumi brushes hanging out. Yeah. Were they hung there for a specific purpose, or was it just a random thing?
To dry them off.
Dry them off, okay.
If any of you do sumi paintings, you wash out the brush, and then you have to wash it thoroughly after each use, and then hang it to dry.
Do you know if he had any? Do you know if he had any favorite brushes?
There was a store in Kyoto that he would buy his brushes and ink from, and so there was, and they different shapes, different purposes.
Yeah, some of them are very precious because they come from the fur of certain animals.
Mm-hmm. And jump back to this one, the Lotus Fountain. So, as we all know, George was really, really known for finding inspiration in the natural world. So, was there anything that he did to help foster your own connection with nature growing up?
Well, this is the Lotus Fountain, and this is actually very similar in design to the fountain on Northeast 8th in Bellevue. But this one was done in Fukuyama. And the story is, this is in front of the Fukuyama Castle. And when my father was a young boy, he grew up in this neighborhood, and there used to be a moat around the castle. And my father remembers, as a young boy, playing in the moat. So when there was a museum that was created right in this same area in front of the castle, and my father was asked to do a fountain. Of course, he'd been doing a few fountains like this over the years, and he remembers the moat and the lotus flowers that were there. So this is an abstraction, of course, but this was his impression of the Fukuyama, the moat around the Fukuyama Castle. But go ahead.
One more thing about the Fukuyama Castle, though, is that his own ancestors on his mother's side were the actual assigned gatekeepers of the castle. So it was an important thing that he felt a kinship with the specific site because of his own background.
This is called Votive 2. And Gerry, what aspects of fabricating these sculptures did George enjoy the most, and what were the least? And what would he do when he was feeling that things weren't coming together, he was feeling stuck? Were there any things that he would do to kind of get things going again?
Well, my father was coming up with all these ideas. He did a series of sculptures with the flat plane on it. But I think that I'm not exactly sure what inspired him, if it was, a religious symbol or what. But
when they had parades, they would carry this banner or standard.
Yeah.
It's very ancient.
The fabrication of this piece is a little bit of a pickle. It was all made from flat, broad sheet. So, you're taking 0.63 thickness, and you have to roll it into a tube like this. And it was all hand hammered. So I'm not quite sure if I did this one, but you can imagine, with a hammer trying to create that cylinder. That's what I look at, because I think, wow, that was really something to see. But and then everything was welded. Do you have a date on this one?
I don't.
Okay.
And I don't think Greg or Amy are in the audience because they'd be able to shout it out for you.
I'm sure it's in the book if you get the catalog.
Yeah. But anyway, he was creating some of these abstract symbols, and I don't know if they were for, Mayumi says, more of a religious feeling or a Shinto design.
His only claim to religion would be Shinto, but not in the ritualistic way, but in the connection to nature, that kind of way.
This one's called Fountain of Pioneers, and I'm wondering, as George became more famous and well known for his public fountains and public work, did anything change for the family? And when did you start realizing that your father was famous?
Actually, when I'd come over, I remember coming on the ferry to here with my father, and people would recognize him. And he never tried to create a persona or anything, but he just seemed to attract a lot of followers in the style of artwork that he was creating. So this is the Seattle Public Library fountain, George's first fountain in 1960. And this is the old location. And this was kind of the beginning of a career of fountain building where from 1960 to 90, he did about 75 fountains. Yeah.
Well, one of the things about his, fame, so to speak, is he taught at the UW for 37 years. So he had thousands of students, and he would run into them like in Paris or New York or in the ID. So, I mean, that's just a matter of numbers.
Well, the other thing was he taught at the architecture school. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the young architecture students would take George's class. Most of the classes are fairly academic, but George's classes were fun. He was a great teacher, and they just really liked him. So when these young architecture students went on to start firms like MBBJ and things like that, they would call on George and to do the fountains after they saw this first fountain. Mm-hmm. And that is probably why my father did so many fountains in a lot of the shopping malls and various public buildings.
Well, it sounds like you sat in on a couple of his classes. Do you have any memories of that at all?
No, we didn't.
No. Okay. Well, we'll end that line of questioning. This piece is called Early Winter, and I'm kind of wondering, what sort of phases did George go through? And did he concentrate on just one medium at a time and then move on to exploring another? Or did he work in multiple media at once?
What year is that? Is that 57?
57.
Wow. That's so early.
This is a Gansai.
Yeah, Sumiyon Gansai. He definitely worked in different media at the same time. I mean, it could have been some inspiration, or he had the materials or something.
Well, I mean, my father enjoyed going to the mountains, mushroom picking, and the streams and water and all that. So this is a Japanese watercolor called Gansai. It's a vegetable-based watercolor. It's different than Western watercolors, in its construction and materials. So Gansai, he felt an affinity for it and did a few of these colorful paintings in Gansai. And I think there's another Mont Rainier in this that's,
Yeah, a little bit later on. So it's interesting that you talk about the color aspects in this. Is it something that he played around with a lot, color, or was most of it non-color?
Well, in his earlier works, the oil paintings and earlier watercolors, it was very colorful, and he appreciated the colors. And he, kind of as he, this is 1957, so he was 47 years old at the time. Mm-hmm. And I think he migrated more to the black and white sumi for expression.
And Mayumi, earlier you were asking if we'd be getting to any of the paintings. Was there something that you had in particular that you wanted to say about them?
No, I mean, there might be some others there, but he loved to paint trees and water, mountains, clouds, rain, rivers. I mean, it was part of a connection between humans and the earth and the sky. I mean, it was the fountains were meant to emulate a circulation of water that goes down and then up to the sky and then back down in the form of rain, or it might be frozen and then become water. So there were different phases of water, which was a key element of life.
So this is a shot of George painting on the Oregon coast.
No,
Not Oregon.
Nope.
Nia Bay.
Nia Bay. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry.
Omaka Bay.
No, that's Shai Shai.
Shai Shai Beach.
That's
Okay, so were you on this trip with him? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are there any memories of that trip in particular that you have?
yeah. You want to go?
Well, first of all, we have to give a tribute to Josel Namkung, the great Korean-American photographer who often introduced George to wonderful natural sights, or just they were great friends. So he took great photos of my dad in these locations, but it was just great to have the opportunity to walk out and to see this wonderful natural beauty, and then to watch him paint it. And he did use color for a lot of his natural scenes.
Yeah. Well, this is the Shai Shai Beach, and those are the Point of Arches. And my father, you can see the board. He had pre-stretched Japanese mulberry paper, and would pull out a board and do these paintings, which were more like sketches, and he would do them very quickly. And I have great memories of camping on this beach with the family. Our family and the Namkung family would go out and hike in from Maka Bay, which was a dirt mud road, and we'd walk down to Shai Shai Beach and pitch a tent down there. And I remember one night, there was a creek called Petroleum Creek, and they sent me to the creek for water. And I went down there with 2 buckets, and as I got closer to the creek, there was a bear standing up looking at me. So there would be a lot of strong memories of camping and going out there. Yeah.
So was George always working on these family trips, or were there any times when he was just like, nope, we're chilling?
Well, he would paint for a few hours, and then it would be time to relax with a cup of sake. And then, cooking dinner and all that. But he always carried these.
Yeah, he always carried his brush and paints.
Yeah.
Whenever we got in the car
to
go up to the hill mountains, he always would pull over and do a quick painting.
When we were at Deception Pass after crabbing, he was a very adept crab hunter, and he would pull out the whole arrangement and paint right there on the beach. And
what about Barwon Lakes and all those?
Yeah, and up in British Columbia, people would walk by and say, "Hey, that's pretty good. I bet you could sell that." But he was perfectly pleasant about it. It was, yes, okay, thank you. So he was always prepared with that, and he did go up to British Columbia and other, some places in Oregon, I guess.
As a young child, did you ever just sit down beside him and do some of these sketches with him?
No, I just took it for granted, just ran around. He was painting, that's just kind of how we grew up. Yeah.
When I was in elementary school, John Muir Elementary, I do remember they set up some art classes for us kids, but I absolutely am not an artist. I'm not able to paint or sketch or any of that. Just give me a computer and I'll write about it.
So, this one in the slide list was identified as the Oregon coast. Am I right on that, or is this Nia Bay as well?
That's what it says on the back of the painting, Oregon coast. But to me, that still looks a little bit like Shai Shai. Mm-hmm. And this was a studio painting, so he would do a small sketchbook size painting and come back to the house. And then this is a large piece of paper. And so this was done in the studio as an impression of this smaller painting that he did.
But he also had some pieces that were done from his sketchbooks in Japan. And when I see this, I think of the Seto Naikai, the inland sea of Japan. It has that feeling. But
water played such an important role or such an important topic in so many of his works. Do you have any insight into why? What about water drew him or fascinated him?
Maybe he's a Pisces, I don't know. But
February 22nd.
He was always, I think water is very universal, first of all. And he really appreciated all the aspects of the water around the Pacific Northwest. And certainly when it came time to do a fountain, it all clicked. Water and sculpture and the philosophy of the sky bringing moisture to the earth and the whole cycle. I think it all clicked for him.
This is a Sumi painting of Mount Rainier, and the Pacific Northwest also had a really big impact on his work, obviously. Can you tell us about some of his favorite places and all of the different kinds of camping and fishing and crabbing trips that you mentioned? How did that all fit into your family schedule? Like, was this an annual thing? Was this often?
Is there a date on that one?
None that I can see.
No, I don't think there's a date on that one.
Or is this later? This is later.
Yeah. Well, again, I remember a lot of road trips, and we'd go up to Mount Rainier and go to Reflection Lake and
Matsutake.
See the big mountain. And so he had a lot of ways to express seeing Mount Rainier, and this is just kind of an example. It's exaggeratedly tall, but I think that just gave it even more strength. And he took liberty and license to create images that were visually strong. So, it's Mount Rainier, but it's a very dramatic image of Mount Rainier. So.
Well, in terms of schedule, one thing that we can remember is that because he was a teacher, he had the summers off for the most part. You would be free, and having kids, we would go out on these trips, and my mom would drive, and he would be looking around for a place to paint, and he would say, "Stop the car," and there's a place where the light was good. But he definitely, in the fall there were always these mushroom hunting trips, so the Cascades and Mount Olympus and so on. And later, when we had this place at Hood Canal, then he loved to paint the water and the trees, the beautiful trees, and the mountains over and over. And it was beautiful, all of it.
Yeah. You mentioned matsutake hunting. Do you have the geolocation coordinates you could give me of your favorite?
I'm bad. You know where they go for matsutake?
Oh, no, sorry, we can't tell you.
Okay, well, we'll go on to the next then. This is called Oboes number 9. And George's trek in the Himalayas seems like it was one of the major life experiences for him. Do you remember any stories that he shared about that time with you? And what sort of insight do you think these stories give into your father's character?
His inspiration was a book by William O. Douglas called The High Himalayas. Mm-hmm. And I just picked up a copy and read it recently. It's really interesting to see how he came across this concept and image. And the Obos was a stacking of rocks, and it was a place where people were walking over a high mountain pass or to commemorate something or all that. And actually, if you have a chance, it's kind of a nice little book to read. So he started this, I think, reading these books. I think it was written in 1951, and it was Douglas's trekking through the Himalaya mountains. And I think my father was very inspired by A, his efforts to get up into the mountains, and B, seeing these Obos. And he eventually, in the 70s, went to Mount Everest and climbed up to about 15,000 feet and saw the Obos. But this is a part of a series, of wood carvings. This is all teak, and teak was a long story. It was salvaged from a ship that had gone aground in the Lake Washington Ship Canal, and he and another friend of his cut up some of these teak planks. So these planks are probably 200 years old off the schooner, and they still had the brass nails in it from when they were assembled. And then he had them in the basement, and he used them for assembling these sculptures. But this is one of the more abstract oboes. You'll see a couple upstairs that are more simple. Yeah.
I just think it's really fantastic that he was able to climb up to the, I think, 15,000 feet level at the age of 67, and he had not been a climber anyway, without the use of additional oxygen. So he went up and with a group of people, and he was very inspired by the fact that the travelers would take the time to build these stacks of rocks that were aesthetically quite beautiful at that point where they certainly were fatigued or tired or cold or wet. And it's part of his belief in the goodness of human, the human spirit. But he did make it up there, and I transcribed his journal of that time, and it's quite inspiring what he did and what he thought during that trip.
This work is called Pre-Eve, and I'd like to use it as an opportunity to talk a little bit about your mom, and maybe if you're willing to share some of your fondest memories of your mother and father together.
Well, do you have a date on this one?
I don't, no.
Well,
sorry.
this is pre-Eve. This is probably right after I was born, or right around that time.
That's your memory of it.
There was a lot of images that he created for that were sculptures, wood carvings, and all that, and it was mother and child. So I'm sure it was referring to my mother's birth, giving birth. And I have a painting in the studio, and it's a woman and cradling a baby, and so I think this was probably right around 1949, 50. And this is cedar, and
I think in the early years when my mom made the trek all the way from Sacramento to Seattle, having never left her, well, other than living in Japan, never been at least to Seattle or the Pacific Northwest, in January, the middle of winter, to get married to my dad, and just not knowing anybody. Anyway, she did the female images. There were a number of them in his sculptures in that early period. Mm-hmm. Not later, but she was quite beautiful and refined and polite and cultured, and very much a wonderful hostess and very positive person. So anyway, she did appear in some of the earlier sculptures, and in fact, she after the atomic bomb fell and her own brother died, he was in the Japanese army, so he died. She was very against the U.S. Army, and my dad had been in the U.S. Army. So she delayed coming to Seattle to get married to him for a couple of years. Finally, she did, after he created a sculpture, and that was the War Mother. The sculpture called War Mother, in tribute to the people that had died in the Hiroshima bomb. And I think later he didn't use these human figures so much.
No, it was
an earlier time.
It was kind of a period he went through.
But do you feel that your mother was still an influence on his work even after he stopped doing figurative work?
Sure.
Well, yeah, I guess so.
Awesome. We're coming to the closing ends of our things
okay.
here, but these are the Arboretum Gates, and you recently reinstalled the gates of the Arboretum after they were damaged after being stolen a few years ago. And did the Arboretum hold any special significance to him?
Oh, sure.
Well, at the beginning of COVID, 2.5 years ago, they closed the Arboretum Visitor Centers down, so there was not much public attention there. And somebody came in at night and grabbed copper gutters off the building and stole the gates. And these gates weigh about 300 plus pounds each. And they came in and unbolted them and carted them off to sell for scrap. Maybe they're getting, this is all silicon bronze, so it's 98% copper. And police report was sent out, and the scrap sellers were identified, and the police recovered about 10%, but the rest of it was just chopped. And nowadays you can have a cordless chop saw and just chop anything up. So the gates were stolen, and the community was pretty upset. I would say very upset. Mm-hmm. And the foundation was upset, and the Arboretum, the neighborhood, everybody was so concerned about the loss and theft of the Arboretum Gates. So about 2 years ago, I was contacted by the Arboretum Foundation, and they asked me if I would like to get involved. And at first I said no. In 1975, I built the original gates, and it was a pain in the butt. I mean, literally, there's a lot of pieces to this thing, and I built it on the floor of the shop, and on my hands and knees getting down and measuring and cutting and welding and fitting this all together. But then I thought, well, who else can do this again? So,
well, tell them about the curves.
Yeah, I reluctantly agreed to do it again. And all those pieces, there's 150 pieces in this thing, are all made out of flat sheet. And you can see there, the form inside is all compound curves. And it took a lot of legwork and resources just to find the basic materials and create them, and then about 4 months to do the fabrication. So the other thing that the Arboretum asked was where to put this in. We looked at several spaces in the Arboretum. I don't know if anybody's familiar, but there's a visitor center, and this leads to Azalea Way. And I said, let's put it in the front of the Azalea Way. And we had our dedication this last Wednesday, and everybody seems to like it. I'm really happy and relieved.
Well, one thing about this.
Thank you.
Well, a good thing about this is it's now behind another set of locked gates.
Yeah.
So
hopefully that nobody steals this pair.
Yeah. Another thing to note about this is the fact that Dad kept all of the records of every design, every single fountain, so that at least the metal pieces could be replicated if you had time.
Gerry, when you were working on this, on the restoration or the actually rebuilding these gates, were there any things that you were in particular that you were remembering about your father as you were working?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was 28 years old when the first one was made, and that's me on the right at 28 and present. So I remember, his work with the foundation at the first time around, and controversy of siting and placing and all that, and working with the engineer, trying to design and build this thing. But, I had a pretty good relationship with my father, and, I was pretty much into the task at hand, and I obviously had a chance to work on the first one. So I had a pretty strong idea of how to build the second one. Slight modifications and all that, but the original design was followed. My father left a 5-foot by 11-foot drawing on a big rolled up piece of paper that was all pasted and taped together of the original shape. So I had a chance to do that. And then all the rectangular tubing had to be was fabricated in a machine shop. So those all had to be welded together, and it's all 1/8 inch, so it's nothing's easy, you know. A lot of these came back from the machine shop and they're twisted, bent, and the people that did the rectangular tubing kind of blew it and they were out of shape and twisted. So physically had to reshape and reform all those pieces to fit the original pattern. But it was a pain in the ass the second time.
Mayumi, do you have any recollections about the first install and the re-install?
What year was the first one?
1975 and installed in 76. So you were
I was
20,
busy
24.
with other stuff.
Well, 20.
I mean,
You're 25, 26.
yeah. I think I got married and had a baby.
That'd take care of your time, yeah. Sorry for the pixelation on this, but Gerry, what do you think that George would be most proud of your work?
Well, you know, I worked with my father a lot, many, many years actually, from 71 till 90. We spent a lot of time in the shop together. But he was good at designing and talking to people. He was very personable, and our relationship was, you know, pretty. I don't know. I guess if we worked together that long, it must have been pretty good. I remember traveling with my father as a younger age and doing a lot of things together.
Well,
and,
you went to Europe when you were 16.
Yeah. So I think he would be proud of the fact that I started doing my own sculpture. He was very encouraging. You know, I did my first commission about 1976, about the same time. And he kind of followed my career till he, you know, passed away.
Mayumi, what do you recall most fondly about the relationship between your father and Gerry?
Oh, well, definitely they worked together, but also you lived
I lived
next door. And with a very, you know, fine wife and 3 children, they were very close to my parents. So it was a real good working relationship. And again, as Gerry started to make his own sculptures and have his own shows, then the rest of us, you know, siblings, we would go and support them.
Gerry, what is your fondest memory about the relationship between Mayumi and your father?
Well, that's a tough question. Mayumi collaborated with my father, and mostly on the writing side. If there was something that needed to be edited, typed, or written, my sister would do it. So I think there was a lot of close communication between the two of them, and I think they both appreciated each other's strong skills.
My dad had me typing his contracts for like big fountains when I was in high school in 15 or 16, and my mother couldn't do it. She had never touched a typewriter in her life, so I would be typing these things with the carbon paper and, you know, trying to fix the errors, but I helped him along the way.
Yeah, Mayumi was very much involved.
Here's a picture of all of you. Big. Can you tell us who's in this photo?
Yeah. Well, that's me and my wife, Judy. And yours, Mayumi, and my brother, Marcus, and my son, Kizamu.
Who's right there?
And my son, Kizamu, is kind of the next generation. He's getting more and more, or actually he's very involved in my father's work and was our chief contact for this Bainbridge show. And also contact for an upcoming show at the Edmonds at the Cascadia Museum that David Martin is curating. And that show is going to open in December, and it is George's work before the war. So this show has been 1950s on, kind of the focus. And David's going to focus on the very early works from 1930 to 1940s. So anyway, come and see that show. Yeah. But this is a family photo. Marcus is my brother. He's not here today. Yeah.
So Could you tell us a little about what you're most grateful for about your life with George?
Me? Well, besides the fact that he appreciated, my writing about the early Asian American artists, putting together, a show for Wing Luke Museum and a catalog for that, he was so close to the other Japanese American and Asian artists, such as Ken's own uncle, John Matsudaira, who's close to Paul Horiuchi, but. I in a different vein, I just have to say that I think that he was a very patient and positive person. He cared for the family and each one. He had a relationship with each one of us. My brother Deems, the musician. My brother Marcus also was a musician, but he was a symphony conductor. So Dad had a relationship with each one of us, as did my mom.
Mm.
I guess the last question before we try to get a few questions from the audience, but what is it that that you really want people to know and understand and remember about him?
Well, I don't know. My father was actually very, very multi-talented, but he was also very humble, and he didn't try to show off. He led by example. He, would show people how to do things instead of tell people. So I think it was a very positive influence on himself, the world, the family, and his artwork. Yeah.
Well, I like to think that he had a positive influence on his students, but also on other up-and-coming artists, because many of them would come to visit. I remember when Roberto Maestas from El Centro de la Raza brought an artist from Cuba or Mexico to visit my dad, and they didn't know each other, and it was just a warm conversation, and just very heartfelt and positive and so on. So I think that he had a very positive influence on other artists. He was great friends with the other Japanese American artists, Tokita, Nomura, Horiuchi, as I said, and it was a very whatever he gained from his relationship with the artists of the Northwest School, which would be Toby, Callahan, Graves, Anderson. He gained from his relationship with them, and in turn he passed on some of the concepts, themes, ideas with the other Japanese American artists and younger artists.
Well, we are going to open up I think we have time for maybe 3 questions from the audience, but before we do that, I just want to give my sincere thanks and gratitude for your generosity with these stories. I think we were able to see a side of George that is kind of beyond the legend and beyond the artist, and really understand what it was like to have him as a father and be witness to his creating the works and his becoming George. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions? If you shout them out to me, I'll try to say them over the mic so that we can hear them all.
And you don't have to talk about this if you don't want to, but your mother was in an internment camp and your father fought in the American military. Did they ever speak about or have feelings about that experience, and or when they came back here and right after the war, did they ever experience, and how did it impact you, anti-Japanese attitude?
So the question is about your parents' experience in the internment camp for your mother and in the military service for your father, and if that was ever talked about as you were growing up.
Well, when my mom was in camp at Tule Lake, lot of you know that most anti-internment people were at Tule Lake. But she was quite young. She was taken from high school. She did not have a chance to graduate from high school. But she was very trained in the Japanese arts. So she often appeared on the stage at Tule Lake with so many of these fine Japanese cultural leaders were in that camp, that specific camp. So I wouldn't say that she was outspoken or confrontational, but she and her family were pretty much in favor of Japan and the emperor. They waited for Japan to win the war because they had the shortwave radio broadcasts. My dad was with the U.S. Army. He said, no, you guys are totally wrong. That will not happen. But my father also could see what a treasure he was about to have as he became engaged, proposed to my mom and became engaged. And he was... He was in the MIS, the Military Intelligence Service, so he didn't fight with the 442 in Europe in battle. He was one of the teachers of the Japanese language at Fort Snelling in Minneapolis area. So he was more of the, intellectual side of the Army, if there's such a thing. And they didn't talk about bad memories of camp or wartime. I mean, he certainly would have faced anti-Japanese sentiment. Certainly would have. He traveled around by himself during the war, wearing his uniform on furloughs around the country so that he could visit the great museums of New York, Cleveland, Chicago, Kansas City. I don't know exactly which ones, but he made a point of traveling because he had never had a chance to visit those places before. So that was a positive thing. And my mom didn't talk about the camps. For a lot of us Japanese Americans, our parents did not talk about the camp experience for many, 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 many years. It was just the camps during that time. But finally, thanks to Asian American studies and Asian American protests and demand for relevant education, ethnic studies, and so on, our elders did start to talk about their camp experiences. So that was during the 70s. 80s.
Are there other questions? Right here.
I'm short, so I'll stand. The image of the piece, Opus number 11, used in the advertising for this exhibition, was in the collection of Anne Gould-Holberg. Where is it now?
Which piece?
The question's about the image, Opus number 11, which was used in the catalog for this exhibition. And where is it located now? Who has it?
No, the family. The daughter of Anne Halberg
Oh, yeah.
has it. Yeah.
That's what I was wondering, whether it was a place where we could see that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there other questions?
No.
Good.
Looks like you did a thorough job.
We'll say thank you.
Yeah, done.
Okay, and
I'd like to thank all of you again for coming today and supporting the arts at BIMA. It's lovely that we have such a full audience here on a beautiful Sunday afternoon. And I would like to, again, thank Mayumi and Gerry for their generosity, their time, and their stories here today.